Many years ago, I was slightly involved in a debate with an anthropologist who's now teaching at Caltech, and others, including the late Eleanor Ostrom. The first, and I would add the last woman, to get a Nobel Prize in economics. And when she got the Nobel Prize in economics, you should see the misogynist hate mail against her. Oh, she's not really an economist. The fact that she got a PhD in economics didn't bother anybody, didn't bother her detractors. The fact that she was in a department which was not an economics department became the basis for attacking her. And it's true, she couldn't get a job in an economics department. So Eleanor Ostrom and some of the other associates, this was well before she got her Nobel Prize, we were trying to think and understand why in many parts of the world, and in this particular case, the lady from Caltech was working on Africa, what was the relationship between the spread of Islam and commercial connections? And we began to realize that Islam, Muamalat particularly, provided a common legal medium, a common legal code on which commercial transactions could be conducted. And that was crucial because every community all over in Africa and in Asia had their own belief systems, had their own commercial codes, and the easiest way to transcend all that was to have a common code. Now, to be sure, there wasn't a single muamalah. As you know, as you all know, there are many mazhab, and even within mazhab there are variations thereof. But two things were important. One, common maritime code, legal code, and secondly, a common commercial code. And this facilitated the transactions not only within regions, but across regions, and allowed this transcendence of long-distance trade. So just like people like the late Ajit Singh and Tan Sri Andrew Sheng have pointed out, so-called Islamic financing arrangements of profit and loss sharing served this situation very well when you were completely unsure whether funding an expedition, a caravan, a voyage would succeed in bringing back anything. This made complete sense in that kind of a situation. And so I think one needs to begin to understand the relationship between the two. Which then brings me to the question of the Undang-Undang Melaka and Undang-Undang Laut. It may be of interest to you to know that the oldest version of the Undang-Undang Melaka, does anybody know where it is kept? Except people in the front row, you're not allowed to answer. Does anybody? Zainal Abidin Burhan is not here. But the first version of the Undang-Undang Melaka is to be found in the Vatican Museum. Okay? And Dr. Liao Yok Fang has written up a version of it, and it has been published under the editorship of Zainal Abidin Burhan, together with Undang-Undang Laut. That was what was crucial, most important to the Malacca Sultanate. Undang-Undang Melaka, Undang-Undang Laut. So if you want to begin to think about what Malacca offered at that time, it wasn't a great port, it wasn't the most natural of harbors or anything like that. What did Malacca offer? Okay. It offered safe passage. Okay. And you had the Orang Laut playing a very, very crucial role, because it was the Orang Laut, if you will, who served as an early coast guard, protecting passage through the straits. Even in the beginning of the 21st century, there are many shippers who complain, who feel insecure using the Straits of Malacca. Just imagine the situation 5 centuries ago. So the deal with the Orang Laut becomes crucial. Yes, the Orang Laut thrive, prosper, providing a certain role which today for the United States would be called the Coast Guard role. Only for this stretch, which is the most important stretch as far as Malacca is concerned, when most would feel more vulnerable than over the open seas. And the Undang-Undang Melaka and Undang-Undang Laut are not set in stone for all time. As trade develops, as new problems and challenges are faced, they are rewritten. Law changes. It is not immutable. And this, I think, is another very important lesson for us to remember. So the idea that law is unchanging, once the rule of law and the meaning of the rule of law is unchanging, is something which really needs to be rethought in light of this experience. So this then raises the question, the question of when and how did Islam spread in this region, in this peninsula, for instance? In the late 20th century, except for the famous book published by MSRI, the debate was whether Islam came directly from the Arab world or whether it came via India. There was another debate going on in other parts of the world, most importantly in Indonesia, where the experience of Aceh was quite different from the experience of Java. And this became very, very evident in 1998, when Medan was burning. In the aftermath of the Asian crisis, Medan was set on fire. True, Lim Swee Leong and his friends were celebrating his 50th wedding anniversary comfortably in the Shangri-La in Singapore. But other more vulnerable ethnic Chinese were targeted in Medan. And the head of the largest Islamic party in the world, Abdul Rahman Wahid, popularly known as Gus Dur, came forward and he said, "Stop this. Stop doing this in the name of Islam. I am Chinese." And this made perfect sense to Javanese, because the Javanese believed that Gus Dur derives his leadership his legitimacy from being the direct descendant of one of the 9 Wali Songo, who brought Islam from Guangzhou to Java. Okay. If some of you followed the late Nick Aziz's lectures on the 3 great mosques over a millennium ago in China, in Xi'an, in Beijing, and Guangzhou. The Guangzhou one is the one which doesn't really exist anymore, although some of the trees from the old mosque still survive. But Abdul Rahman Wahid traced his origins from there. And so it struck a certain resonance among Japanese, who are the single largest ethnic group in Indonesia. By far, over half the population is Japanese. I'll come back to Indonesia in a moment later, but allow me, if I may, to move on to some issues of Malay identity. As you all know, there are many meanings of being Malay, but there are 4 issues I would like to raise today. One, about what it means to be Malay. The second issue I'd like to raise is the whole question of an age-old debate about about the significance of Hang Tuah and the Hikayat. I'm very conscious of the presence of my old friend, Professor Ahmad Adam, who I have a great deal of respect for, and he, as you know, has published a book called Hang Tuah, which suggests that there has been a misreading of the Hikayat, but basically also argues that Hang Tuah is as much myth as anything else. But without entering that debate, because I'm not qualified at all to enter that debate, I think there are some very important issues raised by that. I would also like to raise an issue implied by the aftermath of the readings of history, a couple of issues which are very, very important for our consideration, in my view. Let me begin, if I may, with the question of being, or rather becoming, Malay. And the 3 major countries which identify themselves in Southeast Asia, I'm not referring to Brunei, of course, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And the official recognition of Malayness as a category for mobilization and official recognition really begins in the 30s with the Depression, because the Depression was a period of considerable hardship for different people, the different peoples in the country, and it was Clementi who basically introduced a number of reforms from a colonial point of view, to strengthen the position of British hegemony in this country. For example, the 1931 census no longer distinguishes between Minangkabau and other various other ethnic categories, sub-ethnic categories, if you will, and opts instead for Malayness. The official discourse begins there. There is, of course, a very awkward moment where the very nature of the new discourse, which is also attempts to revive the position of the Sultan, becomes a state-centric discourse. So when Raja Huda and his other nobles in Selangor form the Persatuan Melayu Selangor It is the Persatuan Melayu Selangor, not the Persatuan Melayu Malaya or the Persatuan Melayu Tanah Melayu or something like that. It's the Persatuan Melayu Selangor, and likewise with other states. So there is a tension. There's a tension to this official effort, and one should recognize the contradiction involved thereof. And this, I think, is important for us to begin to recognize. So there is a redefinition, if you will. And one has to recognize that there is another phenomenon going on. And that phenomenon is what is happening on the ground. And there are two things which are happening on the ground which I want to highlight today for consideration. Number one, the establishment of Maktab Perguruan Sultan Idris in Tanjung Malim, and the beginnings of the influence of the Guru-Guru Melayu and their influence on the thinking of ordinary Malays. And this, I think, is very, very crucial because there is a pan-Malayness which they are involved in. And very importantly, there is a man who teaches there, whose name happens to be Abdul Hadi Haji Hassan. He is the historian, and he begins to circulate notes in Jawi to his students. And some of his students later include people like Ghaffar Baba and others. Okay? Hadi has considerable influence, and after the war, he publishes Sejarah Alam Melayu, not in Jawi but in Rumi. And it's published in 3 volumes, and I'll come back to that later. But this is very important in my view. The second notion of Malayness, if you will, is what you have in Indonesia. In Indonesia, at the beginning of the 20th century, there are two almost rival tendencies. There is the assertion of a modern Javanese, and again I would have to defer to Professor Ahmad Adam, who has done a brilliant job in telling us about the importance of Malay language journalism in uniting the Malay nation from the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century. But you have Budi Utomo, which is basically pan-Javanese, yeah? Meaning Jogja, Solo, and Surabaya, and points east. And a pan-Indonesian conception brought in by the Syarikat Islam. Okay, the Syarikat Islam, whom I want to, which becomes very, very influential in many ways and profoundly influential. The other element which I was hinting at earlier, which I forgot to mention earlier, was the role of journalism. And this is where Ahmad Adam's thesis and book become very important, but also the subsequent research by the late Pramodia Natatur. One of his few works of non-fiction is a book called Sang Pemula. It's about Radin Mas Tioto Adisuryo, who is acknowledged as the father of Indonesian journalism, but very importantly plays a very complementary role in the founding and the promotion of Syarikat Islam, and is a subject of his 4-volume tetralogy. Of course, in 3 of those volumes, he's known as Minka, a nickname which I think Pramodia made up. And then, very, very importantly, I would refer you to the work of the late Oliver Walters, who grew up, who gets his first degree in Oriental Studies from Cambridge and comes to Malaya, works in southern Perak, spends the war in Changi jail, 57, takes early retirement, goes to do a master's and writes a book which we now know as Early Indonesian Commerce. And then his PhD on the rise and fall of Sriwijaya. Now, here we know the importance of trade, and very importantly, because Java was a land-based kingdom, it was really left to a very small minority community of Malays from Riau who were very crucial in spreading. Okay? Less than 2% of the population, by the demographic count as recent after Indonesian independence. Less than 2% of the population. But they spread the language. They spread the language, and it is spread together with commerce. There's no doubt about that. And that's why the original name of Syarikat Islam is Syarikat Dagang Islam. Okay? So trade and language go together, and for Raden Mas Toto Adi Suryo and his collaborators, including later Haji Omar Said Cokroaminoto, the unity and the beginnings of Indonesian nationalism, transcending the Budi Utomo pan-Javanism. So in 1926, when the Indonesians meet to decide on the language, they vote for Malay, not the language of the majority, which was Javanese. There's another reason as well, and the reason was to opt for the Rakyat, because Javanese was so darjat bound. You know, you had the, what is it, Kromo and the Kraton, and in between there was yet another dialect. So later perhaps Professor Ahmad Adam can help me with the intermediate dialect. But basically you had all this caste and language of this caste, which the Indonesian nationalists at that time, influenced by Toto Adi Suryo, influenced by Omar Said Cokroaminoto and others, rejected. Okay? And this, I think, is a very important choice. And remember, all of them are Javanese, rejecting their own language. This is not unlike just a few years earlier, Sun Yat-sen, a Cantonese who spends a year here, rejecting Cantonese and voting for Mandarin. And part of the reason is Cantonese has nine tones. You know, I mean, not the Malaysians who speak Cantonese, but you know, the original Cantonese has 9 tones. Most of us trying to learn Mandarin struggle with 4 tones. Just imagine struggling with 9 tones. You know, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is that Sun Yat-sen recognizes that is the language which will unify China. Rizal, Philippines. Rizal rewrites the history of the Philippines. He rewrites, sorry, not the history of the Philippines, he rewrites the colonial conception. Okay? His first, his most important work for many people besides his fiction and so on, is his notes on a European view of the native. And this becomes, in a sense, a statement about Malayness. Okay? I can elaborate further, but the point I I think, is clear. That you have three different notions of Malayness. Okay? A notion promoted partly by a defensive colonial power, which seeks to promote a particular type of official Malayness, and this is recognized, for example, by if you look at the work of Radin Sunarno, if you look at the work of Ishak Tadin, if you look at the work of Bill Roth and others, this is all recognized. So one view, official view here, another counter view from Sultan Idris Training College. In Indonesia, a different view, a different understanding of what Malayness is, and in the Philippines, a different understanding, which is completely devoid, in the case of the Philippines, from religion. The question of Islam doesn't even arise as far as being Malay in the Philippines is concerned. And all this, I think, is very important for us to reflect on, especially as we now we hear people like Rodrigo Duterte talking about Maharlika, reviving a notion which is a fictive notion, which was created by Marcos, and how in this country the introduction of a notion of Bumiputraism especially after the Malaysia Agreement of 1963, changes the discourse. Then you have a revival of a notion of Malayness, which begins in the 1970s, but begins to be challenged in the idiom of Islam by Abim. And then when Anwar Ibrahim goes into UMNO, a split, if you will, within Abim, with Anwar representing one tendency, which is articulated to this day probably most eloquently by Dato' Siddiq Fadil, and then the other by Hadi Awang, the young Hadi Awang, who rejects what he interprets to be what Hadi interprets to be Asabiyah. Okay, he uses the term very, very differently from Khaldun, who talks about Asabiyah as essentially a sense of community spiritedness, and a sense of communitarianism, if you will. For Hadi, Asabiyah is narrow tribalism. Okay? And then the academic discussion of people like Tony Milner, who reminds us that the notion of Malayness, which is bound, which is rooted in Melaka Johor discourse. And we're not talking about contemporary Johor, we're talking about a Johor which ends with Sultan Mahmud Mangkat di Julang. Okay? That whole trajectory and the notion, the understanding of Malayness in terms of a fictive version or semi-fictive version of Tun Sri Lanang in Sejarah Melayu and all that. And then you have a broader view. So, but Milner's conception is still within the Malay language kind of milieu. And then you have Joel Kahn and of course Leonard Andaya talking about the trees, the leaves of the same tree, and so on. So we have very, very different conceptions, which I don't want to get into right now, but which I'm sure you're all quite familiar with. Let me move to some other issue. And this, I think, is very important because, with due respect to Ahmad Adam, I think this, with the passing of the late Qasim Ahmad, who basically commented very, very extensively on Hikayat Hang Tuah. I think it is useful to see how, in a sense, he continued a particular discourse which had begun with Hadi from the 1930s. A discourse which was for them, rooted with the rakyat. And this was carried on by Osman Awang's poem, Matinya Seorang Pahlawan, and then more subsequently by Dinsman's play of the same name. So we have two rival conceptions. One which suggests that the essential Malay ethos is loyalty, blind loyalty, if you will, loyalty to the palace, and a blind loyalty, and another Malay discourse which is suggested by Qasim and so on, where Cepat is the hero. And this is reflected in the two Malay films made in 1959 and 61. One focusing on Tuah as the hero, the other one focusing on Jebat as the hero. Let me now move to, I think it might be my last notion, and that is on, I often argue with, I always say that the first person to go around the world was a man named, known as Enrique, okay? Known to his master as Enrique. It is probably popularized in this part of the world as Pahlawan, as Panglima Awang. Yeah, Panglima Awang. But Panglima Awang is a fictive name, okay? It's just made up. It's good. I mean, you need to inspire people, right? So Panglima Awang is a, but it's a, let's not forget, it's a fiction, okay? Now, who was Enrique, or Enrique, was bought by a man named Fernando Magalhães, or Ferdinand Magalhães. Well, my wife thinks that he might have been captured. Okay, so the Melaka, 1511, Magalhães gets Enrique. And one has to remember that there is a difference between the rights of the slave in Portugal and the rights of the slave in Spain at that time. Yeah? Just remember that we are talking about 1511. Yeah? Spain is only united in 1492 with the expulsion of the Jews and then the subsequent expulsion of the Muslims. So the whole process of the unification of Spain is itself quite problematic. Anyway, Enrique, my captive, and this is from his will. Enrique, my captive slave of ochre complexion from the city of Malacca, okay, of 26 years of age, a little more or less. He's referring to Enrique. This is the man who is the first to go around the world. A man of very humble origins who is captured and goes around the world as a slave. Okay? And what's the name of this guy who plays the Pirates of the Caribbean now? Anyway, this is one particular view of him, okay, the one on the left. And the right one is Cikgu Aminur Rashid, Harun Aminur Rashid, who was a teacher in Singapore and who was the last chair of the Parti Rakyat Singapura after Said Zahari was arrested under the Operation Cold Store in 1963. Okay, so Cikgu Harun Aminur Rashid, a very important figure, but he creates this fictive character to inspire young people. Okay, Panglima Awang. Okay. Now, here we have a slightly different view from the Philippines. Okay, okay. His lutut, you can see, since this is a non-Muslim view of the. And again, Enrique. Okay, a different view. By the way, this is something we can learn from the Philippines. That they have wonderful, wonderful illustrated children's stories. Okay? Philippines and India lead the world as far as illustrated children's stories are concerned. And then, look at how our Indonesian brethren have. So Malacca becomes Maluku. Okay? And it's not without basis, right? Because what happens? Magallanes, who then becomes Magallanes, he gets a Spanish queen to sponsor his voyage. We know him as Magellan. Goes around the world. He starts off with 5 ships. He has a crew which is partly loyal to him, but partly Spanish. And they are fighting among themselves, the Portuguese and the Spanish. And they get to the Visayas, and they basically, well, we don't know the conspiracies of the time, but eventually Magallanes decides, accepts the challenge from a man named Lapu-Lapu. Lapu-Lapu is the name of a fish, but it was also the name of this man, and Lapu-Lapu defeats him in combat. And that's the end of the Magallanes the person. Magallanes the legend, or Magellan the legend, continues to this day. And it is useful for us to remind the world that the survivor then, and was freed under Portuguese law of slavery, but not under Spanish law of slavery, okay, is Enrique. Now, there are many versions. Some people say the Filipinos would claim that he stays in the Philippines. The Indonesians claim that he runs down to the Maluku. And some of us would like to claim that he goes back to Malacca and retires to Malacca. All that, there's no way you can ascertain that unless our friend Professor Ahmad Adam can ascertain that in some way, but I don't think it's going to be possible to ascertain that. Now, I said earlier that stories matter. Fiction matters. And this has got nothing to do with Malacca. Okay? Emilio Salgari writes children's stories. Earlier, Datin Saida reminded us that in China, tough time for people to know about Malaysia. But you talk about Malacca, a lot of people know Malacca. Well, Emilio Salgari inspired, when I lived in Italy for 3.5 years, I had a tough time trying to explain where I was from. People didn't know Malaysia. But I would say, sono de paese de Sandokan. And everybody knew Sandokan. Everybody knew Sandokan. Because the fictional character was more famous than the country. But very interestingly, this is the first recorded use of the term Malaysia. I would be very interested if anybody knows of an earlier use of the word Malaysia. And I think it's going to be very difficult for you because I have tried. There's a subsequent use of about 40 years later by a man named, American professor named Rupert Emerson, who talks about Malaysia. But he's referring to Malaya and Indonesia. And he just makes up this word Malaysia. There's no use of the term Malaysia before Emilio Salgari. So we curiously owe our story to this man named Emilio Salgari, who never left Italy, wants to unite young people with certain kinds of values. And so he reads the accounts of the chronicler of James Brooke and James Brooke's son, and turns the story around. So James Brooke's enemy becomes the hero. Okay? And that becomes the basis for creating this character called Sandokan. Sandokan, Tigre de Malaysia. Sandokan, Prince of Pirates. That sounds very familiar. Somebody else, it's a title of a book about the first sultan of a state which shall remain unnamed. So we have the beginnings of Malaysia in an act. You know, here you have Salgari creating this character. Salgari doesn't live in the, he claims like Marco Polo, never left Italy, never left Venice, but basically, picks up stories here and there. At least this one version, and basically tells a very good story. And he tells wonderful stories, and very, very popular. And Kabir Bedi. Most people here are too young to remember Kabir Bedi, but I can see some smiling middle-aged faces. Okay? Kabir Bedi, the great hero, appears in a James Bond film subsequently, but when he's past his prime, and he plays Sandokan, and he's a hero. And so it is very important for us to recognize the role of a historical fiction. And this is why I have always appreciated the work of Pramodia and Datur as well. But let me move, if I may, back to Hadi. I'm saying this not only because he is the paternal grandfather of Datin Saida, but very importantly because he inspired in a generation of students from Maktab Perguruan Sultan Idris an alternative narrative about Malaysian history, alternative to the prevailing dominant narrative by a man named Winstead. Okay? For the older generation, you all know who Winstead was, and that's how we learned history. Hadi provided that alternative narrative. There are many people who try to continue to tell this story, but as I mentioned earlier, he inspired this generation at SITC. He inspired many who became involved with Kesatuan Melayu Muda, and for a post-war generation, he inspired some of the leaders of Angkatan Pemuda Insaf, or API, which was the youth wing of the Partai Kebangsaan Melayu Malaya. So, very, very important, precisely for all those reasons. And people like Professor Syed Hussein Ali have started what they call the Pusat Sejarah Rakyat. They have tried to offer, well, they call it the people's history. I'm not sure it's a people's history, but certainly a nationalist history of the world. And they have also sponsored the publication of other volumes, which are very much in that tradition. But this is basically a conception which I would like to remind you of, which inspires the first nationalist grouping which calls for independence. And that is Parti Kebangsaan Melayu Muda, Melayu Malaya, and at the second Congress in 1946. The first one was in 45, long before UMNO started calling for Merdeka in 51. And this, of course, Burhanuddin, on the ruins of the city of Melaka, we raised the spirit of freedom, the unification, uniting all peoples, to fight for what is justly our inheritance. So I think it's on this kind of note that I think we have much to learn from the continuing relevance of Melaka from that period of our history, and how it can inspire us today and will continue to be relevant for the future. Thank you very much for your attention.